Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. I'm so excited because today we are doing a very special Thinker of the Month episode with Spencer Klavan. Spencer and I started this series a little while ago, and we have explored many different types of people. Russian thinkers like Dostoevsky, the author of Crime and Punishment, German thinkers like Karl Marx, the guy who wrote the Communist Manifesto, a British writer, Charlotte Bronte, who wrote my favorite book and Spencer's sister's favorite book, Jane Eyre. Spencer and I have talked about figures who we admire and figures who maybe we don't admire so much. But the through line is that we profile people who have profoundly shaped civilization. So as I was brainstorming who our December Thinker of the Month should be, suddenly the obvious occurred to me that this is the month that we celebrate the birth of the most profound contributor to civilization, the ultimate thinker, not just of the month, but of eternity, and that is Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So today, we will be exploring the life, example, and influence of this remarkable person, all while wearing Santa hats. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey everyone, and welcome to Timeless. It is great, as always, to be with you. Just a reminder that in addition to Timeless with Julie Hartman, which is every Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays on this channel, you can also catch my show with Dennis Prager called Dennis and Julie, which premieres every Monday on this channel at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern. And in case you don't want to watch us, you can also listen to us on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. At this point, I feel like I don't even need to give a full introduction for Spencer Klavan because A, he speaks for himself, and B, he's just been on this show so many times. You guys know him. But just in case you don't, Spencer Klavan is the referee in the new show Lady Ballers on Daily Wire. And that's all he's done in his career. No, I'm kidding. He also, in addition to that, is the features editor of The American Mind, the associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books, and the host of one of my favorite shows ever, the Young Heretics podcast. He's also the author of one of my favorite books, How to Save the West, Ancient Wisdom for 5 Modern Crises. Hello, Spencer, and welcome back to the show.
Hey there, Julie. Merry Christmas, and thank you for leading with my proudest achievement to date. And that is my cameo in Lady Ballers.
I know, I should have just left it at that.
Mm-hmm.
But the other accomplishments are somewhat worthy of mention. So I continued.
I put them on the B side of my resume. The front page is just a still frame from the movie. And then on the back of my resume, I list a couple other things I've done.
By the way, where was that filmed?
It's.
Are you allowed to disclose that information?
I'm pretty sure I am. If I'm not, I'll say this, and then within about 5 minutes, a SWAT team will pound on my door. That's the sheer power of the Daily Wire. Yeah, it was in some sort of stadium in Nashville. I forget what exactly it's called. But the best part was that we had a wonderful little group, the most flaccid little group of protesters when they figured out what we were doing. Yeah, because we had extras that came in to film the movie, and the extras found out what the movie was about, and then it got posted on some, I don't know, Antifa or something forums, and we had a few people come with their signs to say this is bad or something, and couldn't really explain why. But it was a very disappointing protest, all told.
Oh my gosh, it's amazing how these people have a way of finding you wherever you go, and also it's just like, don't they have anything better to do with their days?
No, the answer to that question is absolutely not. There are many things that they could be doing that would be better, but no, they don't have anything else on their schedule.
Well, it is such a funny film, and it's so needed. So congratulations on that cameo, and all the other things that you're doing and have done. I want to acknowledge, though, for the audience, because we have a big fan base here as far as the Thinker of the Month groupies. I get emails from people who are saying how much they love these episodes, which makes me very proud. But we acknowledge that we forgot November. I've been getting a lot of emails about that. We forgot, we're human beings, but you know what? It actually worked out really nicely because I got to interview Spencer's amazing sister, Faith Moore, who is the author of a recently released book called Christmas Carol, and it's spelled with a K. Karol, because the protagonist is a woman named Carol, and we had a great discussion about that. And by the way, everyone, you can still get it if you order it right now as a Christmas gift. And you know how I know that? Because this morning I ordered it on Amazon as a Christmas gift, and it's arriving in time. So go watch the Faith Moore episode as a substitute for our November Thinker of the Month.
Excellent. I sent my sister in my stead, and
Yes.
I think the audience got a better deal as far as I'm concerned, because that is a great book, and everybody should get it for Christmas.
Well, I'm so excited about today, as I said in the introduction, you know, and as people who are watching can see, we are donning our Santa hats, which was Spencer's idea. He came on, I saw him in the Santa hat, and I thought I had to join in. And I love kind of mixing the absurd with the deeply intellectual theological discussion that I am sure we're about to embark on. But hey, it's Christmas. We got to embrace the joy of this season, as I discussed at length with your lovely sister. So glad you're here. So happy that we're doing this, because God is the thinker of every month. Amen.
Yes, indeed.
So to start off, I just want to tell you and the audience that as far as my faith journey, I am on a journey. I mean, isn't everyone kind of with regard to faith who takes God seriously? We're all on a journey, but I really don't know theologically what I believe. I know that I'm an ethical monotheist. I was raised nominally Christian, but I'm really kind of exploring Christianity, and I'm loving it. So in this discussion, I just want to warn you, I'm going to ask really kind of simple, basic questions about the life of Jesus and theologically about Christianity, because I want to explore. And also, even with people who know Christianity really well, like, these are questions that you're asking for your whole life. You know, it's not just for the beginners, but
absolutely.
So we'll be doing a lot of that. But before we dive in, I just told you a little bit about my faith journey. I know that you're a Christian, Spencer, but what denomination? How long have you been a Christian? Tell me about your faith journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that basic questions about Christianity are my favorite kinds of questions to ask. I think they're probably every Christian's favorite kind. And one reason for that is something that Jesus himself said, speaking of Jesus as thinker of the cosmos and eternity, that what he had to reveal was hidden from the wise, but revealed to the simple. And as somebody that spends a lot of time in very complicated arguments and texts and researching all this stuff, it's really helpful for me to remember that in Christianity, and indeed in Judaism and the monotheistic tradition that Christianity arises out of, the simplest things are actually the most profound. Sometimes people say that the Bible is shallow enough for a toddler to play in, but deep enough for an elephant to drown in. And one of the things that most astonishes me, that has always drawn me to the Bible, even before I was a Christian, was the sense, unlike any other ancient text, that actually asking the simplest and most basic questions is how you get led to the most kind of mind-blowing and transformative foundational insights in the Gospels, and especially in the words of Jesus, as we're going to get into here, I think. I, like you, I think, it sounds like, I began my faith journey with a kind of vague sense of theistic belief. From a very early age, one of the stories that my dad tells about me is that I was a kid and I would walk out into the outside and I would thank the sun for shining on me. And that's kind of a funny way of looking at the world, but it totally corresponds to just my general inner disposition. My automatic disposition was to sense a kind of presence in the world. But I really didn't have much more theological instruction than that, because growing up, my dad's a Christian now, but he was not at the time. And in fact, my father comes from a Jewish background, and he had left his Jewish faith at that point, but he was not yet a Christian. My mother had a kind of nominally Catholic upbringing, but also was not part of any church when I was growing up. And we had a very, I think, representative attitude for kind of literary sophisticate types on the coasts in America and in Europe where we grew up, which was that free thinking was our religion. We liked the fact that we didn't have any dogma, and there was no rule against going to church in my house. But we also were proud, all of us, that we didn't have to accept any particular belief because we were invited to think for ourselves. And it's interesting because now I don't think that's the attitude I would take if I were to raise kids. I think it's healthy and good to have a background in a faith tradition so that you, even if you do end up not necessarily agreeing with all of it, you should be taught and educated in basic principles in a way that I was not. But I do also feel very lucky that this is the family I was born into, because I'm the sort of person who does like to explore these things a lot. And basically what happened to me is that between the ages of about 14 and 16, I started to realize that I didn't know what I believed about God. I knew that I sort of believed there was a God, that the world had an order and a character to it, but I didn't know what that meant or whether that conformed to any religious tradition. And being the kind of kid that I am, this will tell you a lot about me. I set myself a reading project that during those years I was going to read every scriptural text I could get my hands on. So somebody else would probably have done a much more sensible thing, which would be going to his local faith center or talking to a pastor or something. I did not do any of those things. Instead, I read the Tao Te Ching, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, every kind of scripture I could get my hands on, and also the Bible. That's the first time I read the Bible from cover to cover. And this was maybe my first ever systematic research project as a young man. I think this is the first time I ever did something like that. And it was very instructive because all of the things that I read had insight in them. They were all worth reading. I'm glad I read them, and I've sometimes returned to some of them. But it was only the Bible that felt like coming home. And by that, I mean I met in the Bible the character of the person that I felt presiding over things like the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun. And that was the key, I think, that started to lead me into what eventually became my Christian faith. I was baptized in the Anglican Communion, which is the Church of England tradition, although it has made its way to America under various other denominational headings. And during grad school, I also attended Church of England. So that's my home base denominationally. And it's a pretty, although there are variations, it tends to be a more liturgical tradition. And that's kind of where I eventually got my access to some of the more doctrinal theological points. But for me, it was a very haphazard personal journey, like it sounds like it is for you.
It's, gosh, so much to respond to. I am doing right now what you said that you did, where I'm reading the Quran. I just had a guest on, Robert Spencer, who wrote a commentary on the Quran. I'm reading his commentary. I'm obviously reading the Bible. I can't say that I have ventured beyond the Abrahamic religions, but one step at a time. And it is just so powerful to have an understanding of these texts. A, in order for me to figure out who I am religiously, but B, just in order to be an informed citizen. In college, I would talk with a lot of my friends about Dennis Prager's Rational Bible book, because that's how I got introduced to Dennis and how I reached out to him. It really influenced me. So of course I would chat with my friends about it. And I love many of my friends from college, but some of them would kind of ask like, well, why would we read something like that? Like, this is 1,000 or 3,000, 5,000, however many thousands of years old book. Why would we look at that? And there are so many answers to that question. But one of them, just in really simple terms, is this has shaped civilization. Billions of people believe in this. It is something that at the very least we should know. Nathan Pusey, I believe, was the former president of Harvard. Maybe he wasn't, but I was recently reading a speech that he gave at the Harvard commencement address in 1960. And he had this really powerful line where he said, it's not just enough to know about certain beliefs. You also have to believe in something too. And right now I see a deficiency with both. A lot of people don't even know about what the Bible says. And certainly if you don't know it, you don't have an opportunity to believe in it. So in today's episode, I hope to, for the listeners, accomplish at least one of the two. Knowing what it says and perhaps facilitating a road to really internalizing this and believing it and making it a part of your worldview.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting that we kind of suffer from two seemingly contradictory problems. One of them is that nobody knows really what Christianity is. We have kind of a vague, like, Hallmark card or Santa hat idea about what Christianity is. But fewer and fewer of us have read the Bible or engaged seriously with the claims that Christianity makes and the history of its emergence into the world. But on the other hand, also, Christianity, more than any other thought system, more than any other philosophy or attitude or set of ideas, along with the Jewish thought that it brought into the Roman Empire, Christianity so utterly reshaped the world and upended everything, transformed the face of the West and of the world more generally, that it became kind of invisible. And a lot of the things that we owe directly to Christianity, things like the universal worth of every human life, we now, the people that we talk to out in the world, they just think this is common sense. They think this fell out of the sky, that it's just any good, decent person can kind of work his way out to understanding that mankind is created in the image of God, or if that language doesn't work for them, then they'll say something like, we all have universal right to life and to dignity and so forth. And they imagine that these are self-evident truths not in the way that our Declaration of Independence means it when it says self-evident, but in the way that we casually mean it when we say, oh, it's just obvious, just everybody from common sense can figure these things out. And one of the things that's amazing when you start to study ancient history is that actually, for most of history, in most times and places, most people have not believed a lot of these things that we now take for granted as fundamental axioms of ethics and fundamental ideas. And if you look at people that we might admire in many other ways, people like the ancient Greeks, for example, they were not convinced that everybody was equal fundamentally in some essential way. It took the intervention of monotheism in the form of Judaism and then Jesus Christ and the Gospels to install these ideas in the basic operating system of the West. And that's one reason why it actually makes sense to speak about Jesus and about the God of the Bible as a thinker of the month, as somebody that enters into the great debate that we're all having down here on Earth about what's true and how to know it, and makes an intervention, rather than somebody that sets up a kind of monolith. You know, you're reading the Quran now. I think there's much more of a sense of voluntarism, or this object that it cannot be moved or questioned. Here in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we do have a God that is actually thinking with us and helping us to think through things and inviting us throughout history to develop and grow in what we know and understand. So that's one of the things that I think is most profound about the Christian faith and about God as thinker. And it's something that we miss because it's all around us. It's like the air we breathe.
Mm-hmm. I love what you just said, how we think that this is just common sense and this is obvious, but A, people didn't think this way for a very long time, and B, a lot of people still don't accept these moral axioms. So let's get into it here. I have my chronological Bible here, which, by the way, I love this edition. It's called the 1 Year Chronological Bible. I like kind of understanding the order of things, specifically, excuse me, when we go to the life of Christ, because you've got John and Mark and Luke and Matthew, and it's like kind of hard to keep track of the chronology. So for people who are, at their beginning stages of their faith journeys, I like to call it, this is a really good resource for you. So This is the most me question, and you are such a perfect person to answer it. I say it's a me question because it's like it'll take years to answer it. It's kind of a insurmountable obstacle. But could you please synopsize the life of Christ in like 2 minutes? See, Spencer Klavan is the perfect person to answer that question. I know we're going to obviously get into more specific details, but just for people who really don't know very much, give me the highlights, please. And I'm going to start timing you now.
Fantastic. Well, I'll tell you, the idea of Christianity TLDR, the SparkNotes
Yes.
version of Christianity, is very ancient. It goes back at least to the Apostles' Creed, and I would argue you can find the disciples and the apostles giving the bullet points version of who Jesus is and what he did in the book of Acts. And right after Jesus died and was resurrected, people were already giving the kind of top line news items, the lead of the story, because this was a message that was really urgent and could be kind of explosively inserted into any pre-existing thought system. But the easiest way that I can describe it is, for most of the history of the Jewish people as described in the Bible, it was prophesied that God would send an anointed one, for which the Hebrew word is Mashiach, means somebody that's been anointed by God with oil, or by a priest with oil, to do an important divine task. And this person was going to deliver salvation to the world, was going to sit upon the throne of David, and was going to bring about a kind of restoration of everything that had been made wrong since the beginning of the world, everything that had fallen apart. And when the child Jesus was born under the Roman rule of Judea, when Judea had fallen under Roman rule, this person gradually came to seem to his followers like the fulfillment of those prophecies, which is why in the Greek of the Gospels, he is called Christos, which also just means anointed. It's just a Greek translation of the word Messiah or Mashiach. And so this man, Jesus, whose name means essentially salvation or God saves, is designated as this figure, the Messiah or the Christ. And that's why we call him Jesus Christ. Jesus is his name, Christ is his title. He went on after preaching in the synagogues of Israel and surrounding Jerusalem. He then, on the Passover festival at his 33rd year of age, was condemned by the temple authorities for certain forms of blasphemy, handed over to the Roman leader, Pontius Pilate, condemned to crucifixion, which was the slave's death, and his disciples reported was resurrected miraculously from the dead on the third day after he was killed. And this resurrection, the conquering of death, which was then promised to his followers, was understood and interpreted as the fulfillment of all those messianic prophecies, which is now being worked out until the ends of the earth, when Jesus, it is said, will come again and will bring with him the new Jerusalem that we will all live in after our own bodily death and resurrection. That's what Jesus is up to. That's the promise of the season. We're obviously celebrating the moment he was born right now, which is why it's the Advent season. Advent is a Latin word meaning adventus, meaning the coming or the arrival of God on earth, embodied, incarnate, to save humanity.
Only Spencer Klavan could do that. Best SparkNotes summary of the life of Christ ever. No, this is why I ask simple questions, because you really do learn a great deal from the seemingly, obvious queries. So I knew that the coming of the Messiah was prophesized. It's a difficult word. Earlier on, before the New Testament, but can you just give me some examples of where in the Old Testament this was discussed and what specifically was prophesized?
Absolutely. So one major point in Jewish history when prophecies of the Messiah become particularly important is the Babylonian exile. Many centuries before the coming of Jesus, the Jewish people under their kings, I don't know if you've yet reached the book of Kings, the first and second book of Kings in the Old Testament, but they went through a monarchic period, and they were ruled in Jerusalem by the line of King David. This was the tribe of Judah among the 12 tribes of Israel, who lived in the southern part of the Holy Land of Israel. And eventually a civil war split the kingdom into two, so there was also a northern kingdom. And gradually, the account that the Hebrew Bible gives is one of apostasy, that over time, as we all have experienced, a golden age of sort of understanding and flourishing gives way gradually to luxury, decadence, and forgetfulness. And that's what happened, the Bible says, to the Jewish people. It happened gradually, and there were fits and starts. Sometimes there would be revivals under good kings that would bring back the practices and the traditions of the Torah. But ultimately, because of the extreme apostasy that happened under certain kings like Manasseh, and because especially of the child sacrifice that was done to foreign gods within the Holy Land, God proclaimed that the people had broken their side of the covenant, the deal that he had made with them. And in order not to reject them or to destroy them, but to reveal to them the dire extent of what they had done, he was going to allow the Holy Land to be taken by a foreign power. And it turned out that the foreign power which rose up to take Jerusalem was Babylon, the great empire under Nebuchadnezzar. These were huge, massive megastates, kingdoms with big militaries, terrifying, fearsome conquerors. And in their world, in the world of the Babylonians and the Assyrians and what the Jews called the Goyim, the other nations, there was a rule, which was if your king won, that meant your god was the best god. In fact, political domination was a sort of outward sign of theological righteousness. You were right about the gods if you could rule as much territory as possible. And conversely, if your god was conquered, if you were conquered, that meant your god had lost out in the battle royale of deities, in the game of thrones in heaven. And many, many peoples experienced this kind of loss. The Elamites are an example of peoples that were just wiped out. And the king of Assyria says, I made their gods like ghosts. So when you got conquered, the way that the Jewish people got conquered, it was assumed that now your God would be toast. That was it. There was no more. There should have been no more of this weird kind of zealous God, this monomaniacal God known by a name spelled Yud-He-Vav-He in Hebrew, which we now sometimes transliterate as Jehovah. And this is the God that Christians still worship. Under the exile, when the people were driven out into Babylon by their conqueror, that should have been the end of the worship of this God. But instead, a miraculous thing happened, which is they learned that they could still worship this God even in exile, even without their temple, even without the signs and symbols and the outward forms of what they thought God had to have. They thought he needed this house. They thought he needed this particular location and so forth. But no, it turned out he went with them into exile. And it was in those moments, or in the lead up to those moments, that they often would look to the Messiah that God would promise that even in the depths of this sin and failure, there would be a figure one day that would restore the line of David, that would bring the kingship back to Mount Zion, the holy hill, and would bring worship back into the temple. And so a lot of the things that the Messiah is supposed to do have to do with re-establishing, restoring that original condition of peace in the good days of Israel, when the people were worshiping their God in fulfillment and prosperity and happiness. So many of the things that the Messiah is supposed to do have to do with that, and many of the ways that Jesus' actions were interpreted have been understood as a kind of spiritual fulfillment of those prophecies, that now the temple is everywhere throughout the world and mankind is being restored into that worship that the Jews knew during the golden age of the Holy Land.
So why was the moment of Jesus's birth the right time for that restoration?
That is a terrific question, and there are many, many different answers to it that have been developed. In fact, in some ways, the history of Christian theology is a history of developing answers to this question. One reason why might be because under the Roman Empire, the Jews had come face to face with a king who for the first time could plausibly claim to rule the world. And so many of the interpretations of what Jesus did are, even from the letters of Paul, are comparisons between Jesus' power and the power of Caesar, the power of the Roman emperor, who was kind of the ultimate Babylonian monarch. He wasn't a Babylonian. He wasn't from that line of competing empires in the Near East, but it was like he was the final boss form of that kind of domination, that physical, political domination that claimed to rule over the world, and that claimed that kind of power, that political power, as a demonstration of theological power. That divine power was what underwrote the whole conquering that had gone on under Caesar, for example. And many people in Jesus' day thought and hoped that as the Messiah, he would overthrow that Roman rule, this foreign rule, this pagan imposition on the Holy Land. They hoped that he might lead an armed rebellion. And there were armed rebellions of this kind around that time. And so when he didn't do that, and when instead he was handed over to the worst kind of death under that very imperial power, a lot of people thought, well, that's the end of that messianic idea. That guy wasn't the Messiah. But then when he rose again, people like Paul and many of the early disciples suddenly realized, no, the whole revelation of Jesus is that God isn't going to get into the ring with these earthly rulers because he doesn't have to, because even their rule is already taking place within a system that he ultimately created. He is actually not on the same playing field as the other gods like Marduk and Zeus and Ashur. He doesn't have to fight with them on those terms. What he has to do is restore the creation within which all of that politics is going on, because that creation has been marred by sin and broken and contorted from the days of Eden. And so God was actually entering into our flesh to wrestle with a much greater foe, that is satanic sin and death. And by conquering that foe, he restored and redeemed everything else that was happening or ever would happen from then on. So that's one reason why, is because the comparison with Augustus and the line of Caesars that followed him allows us to see that God's reign and power is actually greater even than any earthly power that could take control politically or physically.
You know, I often say that God needs a better sales force. I would like to appoint you as president, director, press secretary.
Put me in, Coach.
God.
I volunteer as tribute.
Oh, gosh, it's really amazing. I am just learning so much. Okay, so let's go in now to the birth of Christ and God doing that, coming in human form. And, you know, by the way, I find that in and of itself to be such an amazing thing, as you just so eloquently articulated. You know, when we did our Nietzsche Thinker of the Month episode, shameless shout out, by the way, everyone should check that one out. We discussed that, you know, Friedrich Nietzsche calls Christianity a slave religion because Christianity, he says, it's a religion of weakness. You know, slaves used it to argue their way out of slavery, as if, by the way, that's something that's bad. I think that speaks to the greatness of Christianity, that it is, in fact, the main doctrine that got rid of the horrors of slavery. But putting that aside, Nietzsche holds that, again, Christianity is inherently weak and legitimizes and endorses weakness. And one of the things the examples that he gives, in addition to the slave religion one, is he says, you know, what kind of God, all-powerful God, would come in this bloody birth in a manger and allow himself to be so ridiculed and humiliated by being put up on a cross? What kind of God would do that? And I remember you, Spencer, said in response on that episode, yes, indeed, what kind of God would do that? Our God, a great God, would in fact come down to us in this humble way, suffering alongside us. Anyway, that made such an impression on me, because we overlook the magnificence of that part of the story, that this is the way that God chose to come in and walk with us. So we know, I would hope many people would know about the Mary getting a message from Gabriel. Hello, you are carrying the Son of God. Mary and Joseph going to Bethlehem for the census, and then giving birth to Christ in a manger. A lot of people know that story, and then they know the crucifixion, and everything in between is kind of like just up in the air. What are some specific stories? And again, this is a typical Julie question because it's a big one to throw at you. But what are some other stories, in the middle throughout Christ's life that you would really like to highlight for us as an example of his glory and the way that he redeemed us? Before we continue with Spencer, I'd like to quickly tell you about MyPillow. MyPillow is excited to bring you their biggest bedding sale ever just in time for Christmas. Get the Giza Dream bed sheets for as low as $29.98, a set of pillowcases for only $9.98, and rejuvenate your bed with a MyPillow mattress topper for as low as $99.99. They also have blankets in a variety of sizes, colors, and styles. They even have blankets for your pets. Get duvets, quilts, down comforters, body pillows, bolster pillows, and so much more, all with the biggest discounts ever. They're also extending their money-back guarantee for Christmas until March 1st, 2024, making them great gifts for your friends, your family, and everyone you know. Just go to MyPillow.com and use the promo code Hartman, or call 1-800-566-6745, and you'll get big discounts on all MyPillow bedding products, including the Giza Dream bed sheets for as low as $29.98, and get all your shopping done now while quantities last. What are some other stories, in the middle throughout Christ's life that you would really like to highlight for us as an example of his glory and the way that he redeemed us?
So this is a lovely question, and I'd like to start, I think, with a couple snapshots from Jesus' early life that we sometimes neglect because, as you say, the birth and the Annunciation and these moments at the beginning of the story are very blockbuster moments. Mm-hmm. And then there are a few things that we kind of note in passing, but we don't always really grasp the significance of them. And one of them is the moment celebrated in the Feast of Epiphany. So people that are listening, this is an important license to celebrate Christmas for 12 whole days. Don't skimp on Christmas by only celebrating it the day you open presents. The traditional liturgical celebration of Christmas lasts for 12 days, and that's why Twelfth Night, that Shakespeare play, is about the last moment of the Christmas festivities. But the end of those 12 days is typically considered Epiphany, which is the moment when the Magi, the wise men from the East, came to give gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Again, probably know this from a lot of different Christmas carols, probably seen it in creches and different paintings, but we don't always grasp the significance of what happened in that moment, because these Magi, that word is a Persian word, actually. It comes from the successor empire to the Babylonians, had a priestly class of astronomers and omen readers that were trained in the watching of the stars and the rising and falling. And this was a period of great scientific learning, what we would now call scientific learning about the movements of the stars and the causes and effects and the observation of the heavens. And the Magi were inheritors of that tradition and that archival material that showed them how to predict certain things like eclipses and retrograde motion in the planets and so forth. And so they were watching those totally natural movements. They were not Jews. They were not schooled in any of the history that we've been talking about so far. And yet somehow, from the rising of a certain bright star, they came to understand that a king of the Jews had been born. And they made this journey to learn more about who this guy was. And that's why they bring the kinds of gifts that they bring. Those gifts represent all that they were able to discern based on the movement of the stars. From that, all that they were able to discern, they could tell that it was a king, and so they brought gold. They could tell that it was a divine person, and so they brought incense, which is what you burn to worship the gods. And they could tell that this person would suffer, and that's why they brought myrrh, which is a bitter embalming herb or spice. And so, how are they able to learn all of this from just the movement of the heavens? Well, one theory is that there was at this point a conjunction of the planets that the Babylonian and Persian researchers would have interpreted as the rising of a divine king among the Jews. It was the conjunction of the planet that was associated with Marduk, king of the gods, and the planet that was associated with the Jews. And so from this symbol that they had sort of started to read in the normal movements of the heavens, they were keyed in to the birth of Christ. If this is really what's going on here in this story, what that means is that from the foundation of the world, in Genesis 1, when it says that God fixed the lights in the sky as otot and moedim, as symbols and markers of the seasons, there was a kind of story being told. There was communication written into the relationships that we now understand with reference to Newtonian physics and gravitation and all of these modern things. We've made all of those discoveries, but they haven't changed those relationships that obtained from the beginning of the world and that announced this person even to the Gentiles, not just to the Jews from the reading of scriptures, but even to intelligent observers that were understanding the natural world. And that's one reason why Jesus will ultimately become the Messiah for everybody, because he's not only accessible to those who have been schooled in Jewish learning, although he came to them first, he can also be understood merely from the resources of human reason. This is God entering into the intelligible natural world so that people who study and think about these sorts of things can gradually come to learn who he is. You don't have to have a priestly education. You can have this explained in the SparkNotes version, and you can learn what God has done by taking on flesh, even though he is the one who hung the star. So I think that's a very beautiful moment where God condescends in some sense to become intelligible to us and to be visible and tangible in human flesh, even though his real power lies beyond anything we could ever fathom or understand.
You know, I think a lot of people wonder, what was Jesus's job? Like, what was it that he did? And, you know, obviously we're talking about the greater, you know, cosmic, religious, eternal purpose of this person's life. But like on a day-to-day basis, was he a healer? Was he a preacher? Was he coming to establish, you know, a new religion? I mean, one of the things that is very interesting is like Jesus was a Jew. And Jesus never read the New Testament. You know, I think people kind of have this understanding of Jesus comes down and goes, I'm Jesus Christ and here's Christianity. No, this all kind of happened after. So what was it on a day-to-day basis that he did, and what was his proclaimed purpose?
Yeah, that's a great point. He certainly did all of the things that you mentioned. From the time when he was baptized in the Jordan by John the Baptist up until his crucifixion, he acted much like an independent rabbi. He was not a member of one of the sects that was competing for kind of dominance over the temple at the time. There were a few that are mentioned in the New Testament, but also in historians like Josephus, you know, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And these were all groups with particular interpretations of the Torah and of the oral traditions that followed it. And Jesus didn't fit into any one of those categories exactly, but he was engaging with them, and he had his own band of followers. And the arguments that he has in the New Testament are those kinds of arguments that they would have amongst themselves, among, say, the school of Hillel and of Shammai and so forth. But he also, as you mentioned, began to perform miracles. He fed masses of people with very small amounts of food that then multiplied miraculously. He walked on water. He performed healings. He did all of these things. And finally, ultimately, he was a teacher. He was a healer. And he was a Messiah. That is, he was somebody who proclaimed himself to be the fulfillment of these prophecies. And the first person to recognize him as such is Peter, his disciple, who sees him transfigured on the mount and says, I believe that you are the one who is to come. And the way in which that happens is revealed at the resurrection. But until that point, you're right. He's basically a person that a lot of people have a lot of faith in and trust in, that they like a lot, or some of them do, and many others of them find him very threatening and they hate him. But what he himself understands himself to be doing is always kind of one step ahead of any material thing that you could think he was there to do. So yes, he heals the lame and makes the blind see, and yes, that fulfills certain prophecies, but he doesn't then go and make every blind person see, because he has a job that is more than that. He's trying basically to reset the knot at the heart of creation that will ultimately one day make all blind men see. So everything that he does up to the point of the resurrection is kind of like a little image or a prefiguration of what he's gonna do to all of creation by submitting to death and then persisting on through death, showing that God and God's spirit is capable of overpowering the forces of death and decay that the world has fallen under. And in some ways you can interpret everything else that he did as like a little picture of that, a kind of advance image of how he was going to remake the world. And from that we can infer all of the ways that the world is not the way that it was supposed to be. So anything that Jesus fixes, we can reasonably infer is not something that will exist at the new creation. That won't be, it wasn't meant to be this way. It's a consequence of sin, and we don't have to believe that God endorses things like illness and blindness and disabled pain and demonic possession, because many philosophies at the time and still now today would structure society to suggest that those are actually destined markers of people's worth, that this person is blind and so they're less worthwhile, and that's just how the world is structured, and some people are aristocrats and some people are meant to obey, and that's just built into the universe. And everything that Jesus does is designed to show us that no, many of these things that actually feel unfair and painful and wrong are unfair and painful and wrong. And by what he does in his life actions, he reveals what those things are so that we don't have to, when we suffer from those same things ourselves, we don't have to think that this is going to be forever. We do live through a world that is still afflicted with all of these things, but part of what Jesus does is reveal the way in which those things aren't going to be around for all of eternity. They're not reflections ultimately of our final worth, the way some Greek philosophers might have thought they were. They are foreign impositions, demonic attacks upon nature that God intends ultimately to swallow up along with death.
Let's talk about this concept of original sin, because this is the genesis, of this whole. It was actually unintentional, but I gotta say I'm kind of proud of that. The genesis of this whole conversation that we're having, that Jesus in these images or pictures of or examples, of things that he does throughout his life, he's intending to show this is not the way the world is supposed to be. The fact that there's so much illness and evil, and by healing, by remedying some of this, I'm showing you that, again, A, this is not the way that it's supposed to be, and B, through me and belief in me, this can be remedied. So let's go back to this whole idea that the world as it is now is not the way that it was supposed to be, which goes back to Genesis 3, the Adam and Eve story, which we could spend, it's so funny, Spencer, with all of these conversations, I'm like, this could be like 5 different episodes we could just spend on any one of these questions. So good thing we have many subsequent Thinker of the Month episodes to fill. Maybe we'll just continue on and on with this one.
Absolutely.
Certainly go back to it. But so obviously Christians understand the Adam and Eve story to be the fall of man. I want to hear your explanation for that. And if you don't mind, I want to cut in with some of the things that I never really understood about
Right.
that understanding of original sin. First, Adam and Eve were given a proclivity to sin. In other words, sometimes I wonder, is this what God wanted them to do? Did God want them to eat from the tree? Because why would he have given them the ability to be tempted? If he really wanted the world to be as it was in the Garden of Eden, perfect, sinless, then why did he create the serpent? And we know that God did create the serpent because the serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild beasts that the Lord God created. Why did he create the serpent? And again, why did he give Adam and Eve the ability to be tempted? That's kind of one of the biggest qualms I have with this idea of original sin. And look, I'm a true conservative. I believe you're responsible for your actions. You can't go, well, God created me this way. He gave me, he put the serpent in the Garden of Eden. I believe, no, you were wrong. You disobeyed orders. You bear responsibility for that. But at the same time, we can't run away from those facts that they were given a proclivity to be tempted. So how does that fit into the Christian understanding of original sin?
So in John Milton's poem, Paradise Lost, one of the things that is said about Adam and Eve is that they were sufficient to have stood, but free to fall. And this wonderful Miltonic brevity, he captures a major strain of theological argumentation in Christian history, which is that Adam and Eve were capable of choosing otherwise than they did. But they were also capable of choosing the way that they did, which leads naturally to your next question, which is why? Why not just make beings that don't fall, that simply worship God and know bliss and know joy? Well, if you follow that thought experiment out for a second, you'll start to realize what kinds of creatures that those creatures would be. Creatures without free will, without the ability to genuinely make choices, and genuinely making choices means genuinely being able to make the wrong choice, because otherwise it's just a script that dictates all the right choices to you. And so you realize that whether it's an angel or a man, a being without that free will is actually just a robot, like is not fully conscious in any sense that we can recognize as a meaning of the term. And so yes, is it possible for us to imagine a universe in which God created robots that worship him and just feel pleasure? It is. That might actually have been a world that would have worked fine for God. One of the most amazing things about Christian theology is it suggests that God didn't need us. Many other religions, like the Babylonian religion, for example, Marduk and the other gods make mankind because they need somebody to do all their work for them. That's not what's going on here at all. God is perfect, could have enjoyed eternity in bliss without us, and could also have made a bunch of robots that just sang his praises because, I don't know, he wanted to hear nice music or something. But what he wouldn't have done if he created those sorts of beings is created beings capable of love and capable of the joy that comes from love, because our experience of love teaches us that an essential aspect of love is personal choice and will, is commitment, is desire, is love, is identity. Without a personal being that you are, that could choose a bunch of other stuff, but is going to choose instead to spend the weekend with your boyfriend, or get married to somebody, or these things that gradually get bigger and bigger. These are choices that we make, and they're essential to the nature of love. And so what God was doing when he made creatures other than himself was making other beings that, like him, could know the joy of loving. And even more than that, could know the highest joy of loving the highest good, which is himself. And you can't do that without also creating the possibility that those creatures are going to choose the alternative. And so the question is not, could God have made a world in which his creatures did not fall? The answer to that is absolutely yes. The question is, could he have made you, the specific kind of thing that you are, without the possibility of a fall? And the answer to that question is no, which leads you to a staggering revelation, which is that the whole cost of sin, the whole weight of pain and suffering and sorrow that God himself would ultimately have to take onto himself on the cross, that's the cost paid not just for existence or for some abstract idea of humankind or for some abstract notion of any kind of robot creation. That's the cost paid for you. God wanted you around so bad, particularly, that he would rather have a world that can include the fall, can include pain, can include sorrow, than not have all of those things and miss out on the existence of you, which is the gift that he gives to individual human creations. It's you that particularly that he wanted around. And so the final answer to your last question about did God want us to fall? Is it good? Augustine talks about the felix culpa, the happy mistake that leads to Christ and to the revelation of God's love beyond even anything that we could merit or deserve. It's hard for me to call the pain that we suffer and all the difficulties of the fallen world a happy or a good thing, but it's certainly true that the world in which that happens is a world that shows a greater God than any other conceivable universe, and it's the only universe in which you and I, being the kinds of beings that we are, can exist.
So when you say that Jesus was intending to show this is not the way that the world is supposed to be, is it that the world was not supposed to have had the fall, i.e. the world is supposed to be as it was in the first few chapters in a state of perfection in the Garden of Eden? I think that's the thing that I'm still a little bit confused about. What is the world supposed to be according to Christ?
Well, you're right. One of the things that I like about the doctrine of original sin, actually, is that even though it causes us a bunch of other questions, like the kinds that we're talking about now, it begins with the observable data. It's one of the only theological positions that starts with the world that as we experience it. And one of the parts of our experience of the world is that things go wrong. In other words, we would like things to be otherwise, and we feel like things should be otherwise. We feel like we should be otherwise. And so there is kind of a fact that every religion either has to explain or explain away. And many religions will simply explain away and say, no, this is the best of all possible worlds. This is how it was always supposed to be. And Christianity begins from the assertion of that fact. Yeah, bad things are bad. God does not like bad things. God is good and likes good things. If you imagine this as a sequence of thoughts, which we shouldn't quite imagine it that way because God's choices all take place in eternity and in a way that we can't quite fathom, but that actually he's already reviewed all possibilities in one, and his one act is the one act that he does in eternity. And this gets kind of trippy if you think about it, but let's imagine it just as a sequence of thoughts, right? God is good and loves good things. God wants the good. And the highest good, the greatest gift of love that he can give is to create entities that love him back. But love entails choice, as we've just discussed. And so creating those entities and pursuing that highest good means creating beings with choice so that they can love him for the purpose of love and delight. And God, being omniscient, will have foreseen that some of those entities will fall, and that therefore the world will be broken in all the ways that we now see that it is. And so the choices on the table for him now are a world in which creatures with free will do not exist, and everything is kind of perfectly harmonized, or a world in which God himself creates those creatures, allows them to fall, and then redeems them through the coming of his son. And we have to imagine God, I think, choosing that world as the ultimate best of all possible worlds, even though it is a route that passes through sin and pain. And this is something that isn't going to give you a happy pat answer, but it is going to tell you that if you consider like three different possibilities, one that is lukewarm but involves no fall, one that is awful and does involve a fall, and one that is maximally good and involves the fall and the resurrection. God chose the maximally good one at great cost to himself and indeed to the world, rather than the lukewarm one that doesn't involve us.
I really like that answer, and it reminds me of is his name, you would know, I'm asking the right person. Is it William Gottfried Leibniz or Wilhelm Gottfried Leibniz? The 18th century philosopher. Yes, I believe it's Wilhelm. He made the best possible world argument that essentially the third option, this world that we're living in, is the best possible option. And that through Christ's life and resurrection, I hate to kind of put it in simple terms, but like it will all kind of make sense. And all of us have to trust in that kind of journey, which is, as you said, not the easiest kind of package answer, but it requires faith.
Well, it's either that or it doesn't make sense. This is the other thing that I think we sometimes forget is those who accuse Christianity of poor, what's called theodicy, which comes from the word for God and the word for justice. So this theodicy is where you puzzle over how God can possibly be just while also being omnipotent and omniscient and all these things, suggest or imply that they have an account of things that make sense, that takes all the data into account and then makes sense of them. But there actually is no such account on the table. There's no account that does acknowledge the facts on the ground, including our sense that things are not as they should be, and also resolves it into a way that makes sense. Christianity does require promising that sense will occur in retrospect in the light of the new creation, that we can gradually start to see how it might be working its way out now, but ultimately the answer for things like infant mortality or illness, terrible, illness and mortal illness, these things, there's no cute theological answer that's going to make those things feel good or okay. And again, that's a reason why I like the doctrine of original sin, is it's one of the only doctrines that doesn't impose upon the religious person the obligation of finding some sort of mental gymnastics where those things are okay, where you can just, it's, Stoicism is a good example. We just have to sort of accept that this is the way the world is, so why are we mourning over the death of our children or so forth? Original sin says, no. Your sense that is bad is not an illusion. That's not a mistake. That is deeply wrong and deeply bad. And this is what is meant by the Christian idea that God mourns with us. Because in the doctrine of original sin, we see God acknowledging with us and hating death and pain and illness and sorrow just as much as we do, and more, so much that he would die to end it. And the world and the moment when that will be fulfilled and when our joy will be complete is postponed. There's no question about that. It has to be worked out in time. But that's the only theological answer that can make sense of both our deep felt conviction that this is actually wrong, it's not how it's supposed to be, and our longing for some kind of answer that will fix things and set things to right. If you just say, this is the way the world is, you shouldn't feel bad about it at all, then you're denying some fundamental fact about the human experience, which includes our sense of injustice at things that go wrong when we feel they shouldn't. And beginning from that premise, that that's real and that God mourns with us, Christianity works out an answer that ultimately will come right at the end of days.
In our remaining time, can you explain how it will come right in the remaining days? In other words, how does so Christ comes into the world, he walks with us, he mourns with us, he heals, he shows us that there's a better possibility through him. And then he dies. He's crucified. He's treated unjustly. And then he's resurrected. It really is an amazing dramatic story. But let's go here to the central part of Christianity, which is this crucifixion and resurrection. How is a better world achieved through belief in God, in Christ's divinity and crucifixion and resurrection? How does that facilitate the ultimate best possible world that God wants and we all want?
Well, this is actually a really appropriate question to end on, because I mentioned at the beginning that Advent, which is the season we're in now, is the season of waiting for the Adventus, the coming, the arrival, the coming of Jesus. And usually we think about the first coming, which is his incarnation and his birth to Mary. And that is one Advent that we think about at this time. But actually, there's a second Advent that is layered on, without which the story of Christmas is not complete. And that's what Christians sometimes call the second coming. It's really, in Greek, it's heideutere parousia, which is the second presence. It's when God will be with us again. And so, yeah, there's no account of Jesus and his life or his birth or his death or his resurrection or any of those things that makes any sense unless it's pointing toward a final resolution, not in fact the final solution of the sort of the cursed memory, but the actual hoped for second and last coming. And there are two ways I think that we should understand this. The first is Jesus says, if you believe in me, you will do what I do and greater things. That's from the Gospel of John. It's one of the most shocking things that he says, I think, because he's God.
Wow.
So how are we supposed to
Right.
imitate him and surpass him, right? But when I see technological innovations that make people who can't see color suddenly see color, or deaf people suddenly hear their mother's voice, I don't know if you've ever watched those videos online. For me, they elicit an almost automatic sob of mingled joy and sorrow. And those kinds of achievements, which are built on the bedrock foundation laid by all of Western history, are in some sense humanity using its natural gifts to their rightly ordered end, which is serving God, worshiping him, bringing about the world as it is intended to be. And in other words, the world which was created good without our intervention now becomes restored through our intervention, in part. That is, we get to become participants in the redemption and the restoration of humanity. And all of the achievements that we began by talking about, you mentioned the freeing of the slaves, abolition of slavery, which would have been impossible without the consciousness shift that Christianity engendered, the building of Europe, the scientific revolution, all sorts of things that we now think of as hallmarks of modernity, but that were actually profoundly religious Christian movements. All of those things were enabled by belief in God, by belief that the world was created with an order, that it had been redeemed in the person of a human being, and that therefore, importantly, each human being born was capable of embodying the restoring power of God, even in some small miniature way. Paul calls us little Christs. We become imitators of Jesus. And so everything that Christianity has inspired, the feeding of the hungry, the healing of the lame, the giving of sight to the blind, the miraculous things that our technology and our politics and our endeavors are able to do, even despite all the things that are terribly wrong, all of that strikes me as a fulfillment of Christ's promise that those who believe in him, the culture, the civilization that believes in him, will be able to do what he does and yet greater, to exert control over the natural world at a level that he showed that goes beyond anything we could previously have hoped and that tends toward the restoration of the world. All of that having been said, we know from our experience that sin hasn't gone anywhere. Just because we're able to do those things, we are still waiting for a moment when sin will be erased from the world. And that's the hope part of Christianity, the already not yet of it all. Those who believe in Jesus do the things they do because they are animated by their faith, like a spirit that takes them on from within. But part of that faith is the conviction, the belief that all of our efforts will ultimately be finalized and surpassed by God, who supernaturally intervenes to set the world itself to right and to reign again from Zion.
You need to write a Christianity 101 book.
Nah.
I know that you're
One of these days.
not exactly lacking for projects, but you know what? This is, as I started the interview, you know, people who aren't Christians need to understand these things, and people who are Christians need to understand these things. And it's so complicated, it's so layered, and I am so looking for something like that. And as you were talking, I just kept thinking, this is the guy to do it. So,
oh man. All right. Well, stay tuned, I guess.
Go ahead and write it.
See you later. I'm going to go write that book.
Yes. No, this has been so interesting and so enlightening. And as I said, every single question is its own episode, but I'm so glad that we have such a close relationship and you come onto the show and we can continue these very important threads and themes.
Amen. Me too. It's a joy. Thank you very much. And Merry Christmas.
Yes, Merry almost Christmas. And again, shout out to Christmas Carol Carols with a K. And that is a fantastic Christmas book. And also listening to Young Heretics. You've been doing a lot of theology, Christianity related stuff. So always a pleasure to listen.
We've got 2 Christmas special episodes coming up about a lot of the stuff we talked about today. So
yes.
lots to enjoy.
Spencer, you be well. And I'll see you
Likewise.
here soon. And thanks to all of you so much for listening. As a reminder, please hit the subscribe button down below if you like what you see. And as always, you can email me with your thoughts and questions at julie@julie-hartman.com. Merry Christmas. Happy holidays. I'll see you all soon.